It is inhumane and cruel for so many of that Windrush generation to have suffered so long in this condition, and for the Secretary of State only to have made a statement today.
For those of us who from a young age have had to endure and face up to being called names such as Towelhead or Taliban or coming from Bongo land, we can appreciate full well the hurt and pain felt by already vulnerable Muslim women when they are described as looking like bank robbers and letterboxes. So rather than hide behind sham and whitewash investigations, when will the Prime Minister finally apologise for his derogatory and racist remarks?
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
My mother is from England and is British, and my father is from India, and so I get the best of both.
My grandparents are from Jamaica as well, and so it's their travels to the UK in the 50s and 60s that has resulted in me being here today.
It's an interesting one, that, because before I went to school, I suppose I didn't know any different. I didn't know I was any different. I didn't know my family was any different. And because it was all I knew. And then it wasn't until I went to junior school that was when I realised that there was difference in my family. And I suppose then when you first hear it for the first time, that somebody's saying there's something different about you, is then when you start to think about it. And I suppose for me, what was it like growing up? I had a great experience. In my family, in my world, it was the outside that was different. So for me, growing up, like I said previously, I got the best of both. I got to live here and have everything from being here, but I also got to have a different culture and a different experience.
Okay, I remember being at school at about 6 or 7 years old, and a lot of my friends at the time were white. And I remember a conversation in and amongst my peers where they were making some really derogatory comments about another black person. And I remember at the time not knowing what to do with that, because, you know, what they're saying effectively applies to me too. But they spoke about it as though it didn't apply to me. And I remember, like, I am black, I'm sure I'm black, right? Because they're talking as though I'm not. And then when they caught me in that moment of reflection where I was like, what's actually happening here? They turned and they said to me, but you're all right though, Dave. You're not like them, you're like one of us. And I remember at the time really not knowing what to do with that. Do I say that's not okay, and do I make a stand against the derogatory statements and comments that are being made about this black person? Or do I just say nothing because I don't want to rock the boat, and I like being a part of a friendship group, and I don't want to be ostracized or outcast. So what do I do? And sadly, I didn't do anything. I just kind of nodded and said nothing, because you know, at the time, I didn't know what to say or do. And so I think that was my earliest encounter of racism.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's an interesting one because I've had experience of growing up in, as you want to say, Great Britain, and I have really appreciated growing up here. I really got to see the difference between what my childhood was like and what my cousins' childhoods were like. So my father is the only one of his family that lives in England. He's the only one of his family that ever left India. He was the oldest brother and he's got 8 brothers and 1 sister. So I've got a lot of family in India. And for me, I have had privileges from being over here. When I went over there, some of them lived in houses where there was no running water. So for me, yes, it was great living in this country. I've had access to healthcare, I've had access to schools and education, which, yes, they have had, but very, very different. And I've had running water and no stoppage in electricity supply, whereas in India as a little girl, especially in the village where my dad came from, we didn't have running water. There was times of the day when the electricity wasn't there all the time. So yeah, for me, it was great growing up in Great Britain.
And the reality of it is we're called Great Britain, but we're not actually that great when we're, telling black people to go back to where they come from. And even a few years ago in government, the Windrush scandal, where they were actively asking people or telling people and forcibly removing them back to Jamaica when they hadn't been there for like 50 years. And that's not very great.
And it was hard, and it was hard for my mum as well, because she's never, until she was married, so until she was an adult, she'd never experienced racism because she was a white woman in a white world. Her family are white British farmers, so do you know what? Very traditional British family. So she'd never had any experience of it. So how can she prepare a child for what that's going to be like? And also prepare a child for what it's going to be like being from a mixed race family, which at times is very different because you don't fit anywhere. You don't fit as white, but you also don't fit as Asian. So, how do you prepare a child for that? So no, I don't think she did. And I think it brought it home to her that she hadn't prepared us for it when there was something on the news when we were little and we said, or me and my sister said to my mum, so if all the foreigners have to go home, does that mean we have to live in a boat between India and England? Because we didn't understand what it meant and what it was like. So no, she didn't. But I think as we got older and shared with her, I think she kind of got it more. And that helped us to then be able to talk about it within the family of what it felt like for us and what it was like to be.
So my mother was the eldest of 3. My grandparents came to England first. And my grandma was very much, she had an entrepreneurial spirit where she owned a shop and she always tried to better herself. And once she did that, she was able to earn enough money or make enough money to send for her children. And my mum, being the eldest, kind of led the way. I think my mum was 15 when she came, and she studied to become a nurse. Now, nurses at that time, the National Health Service needed nurses, and so there was a recruitment drive that went out to train nurses, and my mum was one of them that got trained. And nurses, especially from the Caribbean, came under immense scrutiny and racism during that time. And at the time, I didn't know what she was saying. It was just one of those things that, oh, mum's just being mum. But as I mentioned earlier, in the sense of my reflections after George Floyd, I remembered what my mum said when she said, you've got to work twice as hard as the white man. And I realized that what she was saying is that in her working career, that she had to do exactly that. In order to progress and to move forward, she had this sense of, because of the racism, she had to work twice as hard as her white counterparts. And she would often say that to my brother and myself in school. If you want to achieve anything, you have to work twice as hard as the white man.
I've not experienced it, or I've not felt that I've experienced it in a workplace at all, which I feel quite privileged about. And maybe that's the 2 industries that I've worked in that have meant that I haven't potentially experienced it in a workplace. But in society, I mean, I've experienced racism just walking down the street. You know, I have been in Nottingham city centre on a night out and somebody shouts, "Oi, you packy bastard." Now, I'm sorry, I'm walking down the street. I don't know what I've done to, to cause you any reason to say something. And in one respect, now I can laugh about it because I just think, I feel sorry for them that. What makes you want to say that? So I think I've been lucky to have not experienced it in the workplace, but I think I've been unlucky to have to experience it just going about day-to-day life, which is difficult and hard.
And throughout the years, as I was getting older, I remember people calling me a number of names, coon, because that was a very popular word that white people used to call me and my black friends at the time. Gollywog. There's lots of things that was said that was referring to my colour and my race. So I've encountered racism a lot as when I was growing up.
I do believe it's still inside it, and I think that in one respect, the only way to change that is by education. I do believe that there are still things where you will get a better job because of the colour of your skin, and I do still believe that people, and I've heard it recently, that people say, oh, it's because they are black or whatever, or Asian, that's why they're on it.
And you can say to a group of people that you're free, and you can say that there is that there is equality, but you just need to look around and you would see, well, actually, there isn't really much equality because a lot of the positions of power are held by white people. What is that? Why is that?
Even my partner, not racist, but even my partner said, isn't it interesting how many people of colour there is now on adverts? And I went, it's only because it's been in the press that you now notice people of colour. You know, it's yeah. So yes, I do think that there is, still racism around that. I'll call it what it is. That yeah.
Our youngest children are dual heritage, and so their hair is more Afro than Caucasian. And for some people, their wives may say to them, "Oh, on your way home, would you mind picking up some shampoo for the kids because I ran out?" And they may say, "Yeah, no problem." For a black person, generally speaking, we don't have that privilege. We have to go to a specific place to get the right shampoo that is appropriate for our children's hair. And that we have to factor that into our week. So on Saturday when I'm in town, I need to pop to that place to get that product. It's not as easy as going into a shop and get it. That's not equality. It's not at all. If anything, that speaks of privilege, white privilege. And so these are the things that I'm talking about the hidden racism that exists in our country, that we need to be looking at to bring equality so that my children, don't have to go through this as they get older. The reality is of all of this is, as I mentioned about my grandparents and my mum, the racism that they have encountered is generational. So when my grandparents first came before they sent for their 3 children, they encountered racism. And then when they sent for their 3 children, my mum being the eldest, they would have spoken to them about the racism they encountered. So coming to a foreign country, they would tell them, make sure you walk in this direction, make sure you get home by this time, make sure you don't go there or go here, because they were fully aware of the racism that existed within Nottingham at the time. And then, of course, my mum would say, you've got to work twice as hard as the white man. And she would say, don't allow anyone to ride roughshod over you. So this generational racism has been passed down from generation. But in the same way, the racist sense that comes from white people, or the actual racism itself, is almost like an infection which is passed down from generation to generation too. And it's very likely that their grandparents were overt racists. But as we've moved forward in time, it's become less PC and less acceptable to be overtly racist. But that doesn't mean that the racism doesn't exist. And so it may be that, you know, a white person may be walking down the street in the middle of the day and a black person is coming towards them, and they start to get anxious about that. Why are they anxious? It's because of that infectious racism that has been passed down to generation.
I think that if you are brought up in a household that is racist, it is very difficult to be not racist. So if you are brought up and your parents are, you know, white is great and British is best, and you know, that's what you believe because that's what you learn, that's what you see. And it's not until somebody has a different experience that actually they may be able to see. Not until somebody goes to school and has a friend who's of a different ethnicity that they're able to see this person's exactly the same. And that's when I sort of say, do you know what? Yes, a lot of it is learned, but actually it can be unlearned. You know, the realism of it is that, you know, I am no different to anybody else. I am just a little bit less white. But the truth of it is I'm still exactly the same as if you had me cloned and I was fully white. So yeah, I do believe that it doesn't help if you're from a family that has those beliefs, but I do believe people can change, because if we can't change, then everything would stay the same.
In some cases, but not in all, it's potentially not even their fault. To be a racist, sometimes I don't think it's necessarily their fault. It's just the socialization in which they've grown up with, their parents, their grandparents, and all of that, which has had an impact on them. And they themselves may say that I'm not racist until they're faced with a black person walking towards them. And they're not able to identify that that is racism because they don't know. Recently, it was the anniversary of George Floyd's murder. And I noticed on social media that there wasn't a lot of talk about it. And of course, with the recent conviction of Derek Chauvin as well, there was a sense I felt that it's done now, it's finished. You know, he's been convicted of the murder, he's going to prison, you know, that's it, let's move on. I kind of felt that sense on social media in particular. But the reality is that that is not the case.